Our next plenary session is a multilingual assessment of language and content knowledge, English alongside different mother tongues in primary schools, to be given by the Professor Ianthi Tsimpli, the Professor of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Professor Ianthi Tsimpli is a fellow of the British Academy, and she has taught and published extensively on bilingual and multilingualism, first and second language development, language attrition, and language impairment. Apart from the Cambridge, she had taught at several universities in the UK, Greece, and Italy. She has conducted research funded by the UK, British Academy, and British Council. She is also a member of the editorial board of a large number of international journals in the field. Since 2016, her work has focused on primary education in India. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Ianthi Tsimpli.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the water. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the pleasure and honor to be with you in this very important conference on language assessment. So, as my title says, I'm going to be talking about multilingual assessment, which is a relatively underexplored area, both for language and content knowledge. And the strand I'm placing this talk in is with English alongside different languages. So, as we all, I think, agree, assessment is key to education goals. So we know that all school subjects, not just English, are assessed through language across the curriculum. So you have math, science, environmental science, language classes, all of them are mediated by language. Language assessment, as we know, can be oral or written, whereas when you look at content assessment, that's typically written. But when you look at the choice of language of education, and by extension, the language of assessment, in many, many parts of the world, particularly the non-Anglophone world, where multilingualism is the societal norm, is a difficult one and a political one for educators and education authorities. So in this conference, I don't need to say that language assessment measures 4 skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Could be formative or summative. And of course, summative assessments can have important implications for transition to the next class, the next grade, or university entry. Formative assessments, on the other hand, aim to monitor progress and identify areas of weakness in the learner so as to provide feedback and support them. However, we need to keep in mind that in order to perform in any of these 4 skills, the learner's ability draws on language knowledge, that is proficiency, but also awareness of the language and language usage across all areas of language. So vocabulary, grammar, morphology, semantics, pragmatics, because they're all integrated in what we call language. Now, content assessment, as opposed to language assessment, can also be oral or written, formative or summative. When we look at the global north, language assessment seems to be kept distinct from content assessment, because language assessment is restricted to specific genres of text. It focuses on real situations, on communication skills, vocabulary, and grammar. An exception to that is CLIL, the Content and Language Integrated Learning, which typically also has a unilingual assessment code. So if CLIL, which is usually with English as the language of content and integrated learning, is also in English. So both the assessment and the teaching happens in the same unilingual mode. So what I'm going to do today in my presentation, I'm going to look at different contexts of where English lives alongside other languages. So first of all, the first context is English as a school subject in countries where English is not the societal language, so where it is a second language or a foreign language, and that would be the classroom context. The second context is English living alongside other languages in the brain of individuals and the small communities of individuals in Anglophone countries like the UK. So the term that we use in the UK for this group of individuals is EAL for pupils in schools. The third context is the context of EMI, so English as a medium of instruction in non-English speaking countries, again classroom contexts, but these countries are multilingual. So I'm going to exemplify with a study on India, which is an example of the context C, so where English is used as a medium of instruction, and a second study, which is from China, but it is part of a context A, where English is used as a school subject, but in a bilingual school where Mandarin is the societal language, but Korean is the heritage language. So we're going to look at the three-language situation. So starting with the first context, I think you're all familiar with that, English as a second or foreign language. So it seems that in this context, in the majority of the world of non-Anglophone countries, oral and written language often need to develop in parallel. So this is unlike first language development, where the oral language precedes the written language development, okay? And this is true in any educational context, whether this is a formal one like school or university, or a more informal one like after-school clubs and so on. In this context of ESL and EFL, it's usually the case that the written language takes precedence over the oral language. So usually pupils or students or learners are better at reading and writing than at oral language. And they're also better at the more formal register compared to the colloquial register. And that can all be explained because of reduced oral input and over-reliance on textbooks and written material. The second context is English as an additional language, and this is the UK context. English EAL children in the UK are always assessed with the same tests as children who have English as first language, and I will use EF, English as first language, to refer to them. National exams are the same for EF and EAL children. There are no adaptations. And also standardized assessment tools for language ability, both expressive and receptive vocabulary, for example, grammar, oral, and reading skills, are used the same with EAL and EF children. And there are various studies that have shown that there is a risk of misdiagnosis of developmental language delays in children assessed in the second language. There is a risk of overdiagnosis, so where you see a problem with language proficiency, you attribute it to a developmental language disorder, or there is a problem of underdiagnosis where there is a problem in proficiency in the second language, in English in this case, and you assume that this is because the child is a second language learner. So it's very hard to base diagnosis of developmental language trajectories on the basis of a second language. So this is just some information for you to see what the percentage of EAL pupils is in primary and secondary state schools in England. You can see the raw numbers, the head count, and you can see the percentage. And you see the classification is known or believed to be English, the language, known or believed to be other than English. And you can see there that in primary schools, we have 22 or 23%, depending on the year. You can see this is from the last 2 years. And in secondary school, it's 18%. So that's a very significant number of pupils there. So one would expect that we would see an effect on attainment because somebody is EAL or because somebody is EF, English as a first language. So what you see here is the results from the SATs. The SATs are the national exams that are taken at age 11, so when children leave primary school. And they are tested on grammar, punctuation and spelling, maths, and reading. And what you can see for the EAL as opposed to the EF children is that there is no difference. Okay, so there is no significant difference. They are performing similarly when we average across the groups. So there is no attainment gap as such in the SATs, okay? And these pupils, the EAL ones, are bilingual or multilingual learners who, however, have plenty of input in English, both at school, with English-only instruction, and out of school, because this is the societal language. So they are really immersed, both in the educational sense and in the societal sense. If you, however, try to break down these numbers, you will see that there is a lot of variation in attainment in SATs if you consider ethnicity and if you consider socioeconomic status. So when you look at children that are entitled to free school meals, this is what FSM stands for, you will see that the performance is lower. So when we average over learners, we may not get a very accurate picture. There are other factors that seem to play an important role. Moreover, whether English is the first language or an additional language is based on parental reports, which may be incomplete or inaccurate. And we have seen that a lot with work that we've been doing in UK schools and the classification of EAL children, which is very different among the children's profiles. So there is certainly need for more in-depth implications for language and content assessment within the EAL group. That is age of arrival in the UK, literacy in the other language, in the heritage language, maintenance of bilingualism, and so on. The third context is the context of a non-indigenous language, in this case English, which is used as the medium of instruction and assessment. As we all know, the choice of language or medium of instruction in schools is partly determined by colonial history in particular, as well as social or public pressure. So you get examples of where English is the medium of instruction, the countries which have adopted English as the medium of instruction, as well as other languages like French and Portuguese. When we turn, however, to many countries of the global south, language and content assessment go hand in hand. So they're different from what we see in the global north, again with the exception of CLIL. And these are, language and content assessment in this context is unilingual, that is in the language of instruction. Oops. But the issue is, this is, by the way, AI generated, so that's my contribution to AI for today. It's often the case, however, that language and content assessment in this context of the global south, they trip over together with poor learning outcomes attested for both. So somehow, we don't really know whether poor learning outcomes are due to language problems or to content knowledge. So when we think of assessment tools, we need to consider who it is we need to assess, and the previous talk actually made that quite clear. Teaching, learning, and assessment have to form a continuum. So instead of looking at them as different parts of educational goals, they seem to be going together in a continuous trajectory. We heard about the Common European Framework for Reference of Reference for Languages. And one important notion that seems to be promoted there is the notion of the learner as a social agent, acting in the social world and exerting agency in the learning process. As we will see in the study that I'm going to present in a minute, we'll see that this agency is actually not very clear. So syllabuses based on needs analysis should be based on needs analysis and oriented towards real-life tasks. And so this is promoting an idea of proficiency rather than deficiency. Again, this was mentioned before. So it's good that we've heard about mediation in the previous talks. I don't have to say much. I just want to say that Sefer actually talks about mediation a lot, and it's really interesting to see what mediation means. It could mean a lot of things. It's not just one. So mediation is used for communication purposes, and it could involve translation or interpretation, a paraphrase, summary, or record for a third party. So something like a reformulation of content of a message, which is to help communication purposes. So let's keep that in mind and move forward. So for me, the question about assessment is whether we should prioritize the profile of the learner and whether the diversity of the learners can be taken into account when we create assessments. So the question I would like to pose is whether it is possible, fair, and feasible to use the same assessment tool with learners that come from diverse first languages. They come from monolingual as opposed to multilingual settings. They come from different education systems. They come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. And they come from different social-linguistic communities, those with high linguistic diversity and those with low linguistic diversity. So I'm going to use the term translanguaging, although I do not fully subscribe to it, and I have to be clear about that. When I use it, I mean code mixing, code switching, going between languages for the purpose of negotiation of meaning. So we use translanguaging in intervention programs in India on the assumption that we base this intervention program on a continuum of teaching, learning, and assessment. So I'll start with India first. Sorry. So India, as we all know, is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world. It has 22 scheduled languages, the official languages recognized by the Constitution. There are 462 different languages spoken in the country. And in fact, the UNESCO Linguistic Diversity Index is extremely high. So in this linguistically diverse context, we expect a lot of linguistic diversity and multilingualism in the classroom, particularly in urban classrooms, in urban areas. And this is because of high levels of internal migration from rural to urban. So this is what we find. But at the same time, English, as you know, has a very powerful role in India because it is assumed to be a way of improving one's socioeconomic status. There is a lot of parental pressure to introduce English as a subject at year 1, although it is now at year 3, and to also use English as the medium of instruction because EMI is assumed to be the panacea for learning the language and addressing one's socioeconomic adversities. However, the reality is that levels of English across India remain low because the teachers' own levels of English, their own proficiency, is actually quite limited, and the appropriate resources are missing for the child, for the learner, to support literacy, not only in English, but in any language. And I'm talking about government schools. I'm not talking about the elite international schools, which are always English medium. So based on this description, English medium instruction is only in name, and the actual teaching takes place in the regional or local languages, or in regular language mixing, or translanguaging, or code mixing, whatever term you want to use, that's fine. And we have actually documented this in a project that we ran, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But this is on the paper that we published with Amy Lightfoot, also from the British Council, and a number of collaborators from that project in the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. So these are EMI schools in Delhi and in Hyderabad, and it's the amount of language use, and the different languages that are used during lesson delivery. So if it's an EMI school, you expect English, which is in blue, to be everywhere, yeah? So the pie chart should be one monochrome. But actually what you see is that in Delhi, there is no English only. There is in the EMI school. What you see is Hindi for a quarter of the time of the lesson, and the rest is language mixing, Hindi and English. In Hyderabad, there is more variety, and there is some English only. But here, we also see Telugu being used, which is the regional language, and language mixing, and some Hindi. So that, I hope, illustrates in a more quantified way that the input in EMI schools is not English. At least it's not English alone. So the challenges that are faced for EMI in this context is that there is no continuity between what the child speaks, the languages the child is exposed to at home or in the community, and the school language. As I mentioned, there is reduced home literacy support in English or other languages, and it seems that there are very low levels of attainment, both in English and content subjects in EMI schools. I was responsible for a project, the Multilingual project, between 2016 and 2020. This was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the so-called DFID, then called DFID, and now it's FCDO. We tested 2,500 learners, one-to-one, in Patna, in Delhi, and in Hyderabad, always in government primary schools. And we tested them in literacy, in the regional language, and in English, in their oral language skills, so both their production skills in storytelling as well as in listening comprehension. We tested them in numeracy, in problem solving, in their intelligence, and their other cognitive abilities, for example, working memory. The link that you see there is the full report of the project, which is available through the website. And we also have, in this project, we tested teacher qualifications. We gave questionnaires to teachers and head teachers about their qualifications, their languages, and their attitudes and practices towards multilingual education. This is just one slide on the findings we have from the Multilingual project with regard to literacy, and I just want to walk you through that. So this is based on the test, which is the ASER task. Probably you've heard of it, the annual Status of Education report. This is a task that is produced in many different languages by a very large NGO, Pratham, and it is used in many countries, not just India, and it has been used with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children. This task is a literacy task. You can find it online, you can download it, it exists in different languages, so we used exactly this task, and the only difference between the original task and what we did is the original task didn't have comprehension questions, reading comprehension questions. So we added reading comprehension questions to the stories of the task. So what you see here on the graph, the dark blue is the regional language performance, so Hindi or Telugu, and the light blue is English. And you can see from the left to the right, you start with letter recognition, then word reading, paragraph reading, story reading, and finally comprehension. So I hope you can see that, I mean, the decline that you see across the components is absolutely normal because it's easier to read letters than to read stories. But what is really striking is that English is really very low, and when you reach the level of comprehension, it's significantly lower than that of the regional language. So the problem is understanding what one reads. So we decided that the main outcome of our study, the Multilingual study, which had British Council as the most significant partner, was to focus on reading comprehension. So if we are going to produce any interventions or try and implement any interventions, we should focus on reading comprehension and how we assess these children. Now we know that reading comprehension builds on oral abilities, so listening comprehension, as well as on decoding skills, but that's not enough. So in the UK, at the SATs, exams, we find around 30% of children, monolingual children speaking English, who fail the reading comprehension test. So they have very good oral skills, they are native speakers of English, they are very good at reading aloud, but they cannot seem to understand the meaning of what they're reading, particularly when it becomes more and more complex. So what is important here is to understand that for reading comprehension to be attained, the teacher needs to help with some strategies. And these strategies are quite simple. So questioning after a certain passage is presented, requiring the child to do some critical thinking, inferencing, and of course vocabulary development. Now, in the UK, no textbooks are used in primary school. So children get to borrow books from the school library, but we don't have textbooks that we give out to the children. In traditional primary education systems like India and many, many other countries, learning is based on textbook reading. So you can understand that if reading comprehension is very low, that could lead to very little learning, and this is what we find. So what we did following Multilingual is I was fortunate enough to get a series of funded projects to address poor reading comprehension skills in India, and to do an intervention for that. And the pillars of this intervention was to follow a multilingual approach in teaching, learning, and assessment, to focus on orality, which was something that was very low in Indian classrooms, but very strong in Indian children. Learner agency, according to the CEFR, and obviously teacher training. So as far as the teachers are concerned, we ran several teacher training workshops. We created with the teachers multilingual lesson plans, and we have the templates available. We had follow-up observations in the classroom, and this intervention lasted for 7 months. I hope you can see that the children are sitting on the floor, and some of them are sitting at desks. They were asked to sit on the floor because one of the important parts of the intervention is to encourage peer group discussion. And what's really important and new is that this was a multilingual classroom. So we had a structured and planned multiple language use. We used the target language of the textbook, and that was English. And then we also used in oral interaction 2 supporting languages, home languages or the regional language. So reading comprehension and listening comprehension strategies were taught with structured home language usage, and we targeted vocabulary and argumentative discourse skills in order to improve the critical thinking and interaction between the teacher and the learner. It is a big pedagogical change for the traditional Indian classroom to ask the teacher to bring the children together in groups and ask them to speak in multiple languages and address a particular question that the teacher provides based on the text. So we did that, and we put a lot of emphasis in this intervention on improving oral skills of the children in order to get them to think and question. And I have to say again, orality is particularly strong in Indian children, in fact, in Indian individuals. Okay, so this is, there's a lot more that I could say about that, but let me just focus on the results. We had an intervention group, which was 170 children, and they were in a government school. And we had a low-cost private school control group of 50 children. And we tested them at 3 points, from left to right. So at point 1, the government school children underperformed in reading comprehension. They also underperformed in vocabulary and in the reception of grammar, English grammar. At the second time point, the significance was there, but it was lower. And at the third time point, that is at the end of the intervention, the 2 groups were the same. So they caught up. And the intervention group improved by 30%. The new project, which is funded by the British Council in India, is called the Multi-Ed project, and it's looking at teaching, learning, and assessment, and it involves a collaboration of these different researchers and an army of research assistants in each field in Assam and Delhi. We build on the same intervention, and this is, again, government schools only. I don't know, okay. So as part of this multi-ed project, we introduced multilingual English assessment in this highly linguistically diverse education context. We follow SEFR in bringing together teaching, learning, and assessment, and we allow for skills in the home language or the regional language to be used for building knowledge in the new language. This is also in collaboration with Cambridge University Press and Assessment, the unit which is for partnerships for education. So the rationale behind this is to say that if we encourage translanguaging for teaching and learning, it would be unfair not to include that some degree of multilingualism in assessment, because the learner would be at a loss at this point. So what we have developed is planned code mixing or code switching in the classroom and didactic activities in EMI classrooms, while with encouraging children to engage with their home and regional languages. So the advantages of multilingual assessment are known because what exists shows that it helps scaffold understanding, especially if what we are testing is content knowledge. And it has greater ecological validity, as multilingual learning has as well, because no language suppression is required. The multilingual assessment of reading comprehension, which we did in Hyderabad, involved testing with questions that were addressing inference making, vocabulary, and factual questions, questions based on the text. And this multilingual mode of test administration, which I'm going to show you in a minute, should lead children to better reasoning abilities, which are not restricted by proficiency in English. And this is reflected in a deeper processing of information, as you will see in a minute. So the research questions we asked were whether multilingual assessment benefits text comprehension abilities among children in EMI classrooms in India. These are underprivileged children with no home literacy support. The second question is whether these benefits, if any, are visible in the comprehension of both expository text, which is the school language, so environmental science texts, and narrative texts, which are the English language textbooks. These have narrative genre. And the third question is, are there any, if these benefits are visible, particularly in association with certain aspects of text comprehension. So we had 105 children there. They were all in grade 4. They were attending government EMI schools in Hyderabad, and we divided them in two groups. The control group that had English only in the teaching, so EMI in the teaching and in the assessment, and the target group, which was the group that had a bilingual assessment tool, where they had the same text in English as the control group, but they answered questions to these texts in English and the regional language. Not the same question twice, different questions. Half of them were in Telugu, half of them in English. So each group was assessed for comprehension of two types of text, the expository text from environmental science and the narrative text for language knowledge, okay? So that's language assessment. I'm not going to have time to present the narrative, but I will talk a little bit about the expository. The text, we did not design the text. The texts were from the children's textbooks, and the only thing we did is that instead of presenting the whole text to the child for assessment, we presented it in chunks, because we realized that if the child loses information from the first part of the text, they will obviously not be able to address comprehension questions at the end. So there is a cumulative effect of lack of understanding. And after each chunk of the text was presented, we had multiple choice questions that related to different aspects of text comprehension. Okay, I don't know how much you can see from that, but this is an example of the two different chunks from a text from the environmental science textbook. And what you can see highlighted there is that for the control group and the target group, some questions were in the same language. Okay, the same questions in the same language, in this case, English. But some questions were in different language. So for the control group, it was always English. For the intervention group, the target group were in Telugu. And the types of questions we used were vocabulary, so what does pollution mean? And then they would be given MCQs for different MCQs. There were factual questions and inferential questions. So I think I don't have much time to go through that, but I want to point out the multimodal aspect of this. So I said that orality is very strong in Indian children. At the same time, their reading ability is very weak, okay? So what we did here is we tried to use both oral and written, so a multimodal approach to presenting the material that was to be assessed. So the teacher reads the text chunk aloud, the children read as well, and then they answer the multiple choice questions. The questions are read out by the teacher aloud. The teacher then summarizes the gist of the text in 2 to 3 sentences and then goes on to the next chunk. Okay, and here are the results. So control means the control group, target means the target group. A target group had bilingual assessment, the control group had English only. So you can see English is the language of the item, Telugu is the language of the item. So what you can see here is that, so what you can see here is that there is an effect of group, so the target group performs better overall compared to the control group, both with local inferences, factual questions, and vocabulary. And we also have a significant interaction between the language of the items and the group. So the advantage of the target group was more visible when they could respond the questions in Telugu, okay? But, importantly, we also found that when you look at the responses to English questions, the same English questions, the target group actually performed better, and in particular with factual questions on the text. Okay? So the advantage is not just that they were better with the regional language, they were actually better in answering comprehension questions in English, the same comprehension question, when they were presented with a bilingual assessment tool. So overall, the target group exhibits better performance in the two-language comprehension. I will go very quickly. I have to say that these results are the same for the English language textbook, so the results are the same. Okay, I'm going to speak very briefly about this because this is a case study of a PhD student of mine. She did that study in China. And what is unusual about this study is that she looked at northeast China in the Jilin region, where there is a strong ethnic Korean minority. And there are bilingual schools there that teach in Mandarin and in Korean. And what she did, what the student did, Tiani, she did an intervention study using translanguaging pedagogy, very much along the lines of what we did in India. However, notice that here the lingua franca is Mandarin, okay, and the strong language is Mandarin. And the difference is Korean. So Korean is supposed to be the heritage language of the children, okay, but there was a lot of variation among the children in terms of their proficiency in Korean. And so she looked at 60 children, the control group and the target group, and what she did is she used, so the same language teacher was responsible for teaching the control group and the intervention group, the translanguaging group. And what she did is, in the translanguaging, the intervention group, she created trilingual word banks. They completed language mixed sentences, so code switched. They read aloud in 3 languages in sequence. They compared linguistic features across languages, and they did multi-directional translation. So we assessed them. I will take 1 minute, okay. We assessed them on vocabulary, the vocabulary that was used in the textbook, and you can see that the multiple choice could be in different languages. And we tested them on morphological awareness, whether they know how inflections work in English. This is a MOP. Now there's another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2 to see if they can do the plural, compounds, and derivational suffixes. And, long story short, over a 13-week intervention, the translanguaging group improved significantly, more than the comparison group, in textbook-based vocabulary and morphological awareness, and both outcomes show a very large effect size in the post-intervention comparison. The 2 groups didn't differ at all before the intervention started, but after the 13 weeks, the group that had more Korean to learn English actually was significantly better in English than the control group. So to conclude, multilingual resources seem to empower teachers and learners in comprehension strategies, improve reading comprehension and listening comprehension. They synchronize oral and written skill development. They bring school skills closer to life skill development. And the children, at least in India, we observed more attendance, okay, which was reported by many of the teachers, and they were smiling. They were happy to go to school. So thank you very much.